Native Americans in the United States. We talked about Native Americans and how they migrated to the United States and how technically they were the first ones here. Not Christopher Columbus, not any of the explorers we studied. So let's look at the history of Native Americans in the United States. You will use this lecture to help you do your Trail of Tears timeline and your Trail of Tears sensory poems. All that information comes towards the end, but you need to pay attention. Let's start at the beginning. Before colonial rule, so before Europeans set up, this is a general map of where Native American tribes lived. There are various tribes living in these various regions, so each color is a different region, and then you had tribes living in that region. So over here in the south, you had Cherokee, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, you have Shawnees up here. In the middle, you have the Cheyenne, you have the Kiowas. Down here, you have some Mexican, or what's associated with ancient Mexico tribes. You have the Eskimos. So there's all these Native American tribes already established in the United States. They believed in preserving land and natural resources, and then they also did not believe that they owned the land, but that it was to be shared between everybody. The fact that they did not believe you can own land is what's going to cause problems in the future. Alright, so colonial rule. The Spanish show up, the French show up, the British show up, and they all have different interactions with the Native Americans. The Spanish enslaved the Native Americans, and they forced them to convert to Catholicism. France used the French as trading partners, and Britain forced Native Americans off their land and had multiple violent altercations with them over land. So there were two major wars in North America. There was the French and Indian War. The Native Americans helped the French because they were allies. The Native Americans thought they would be able to keep their land, but they ultimately lost the war. And so they didn't. The land was given to the British. Then the British and the American colonists start a war, and the Native Americans fought with the British because they hoped the British would protect their land like they did with the Proclamation of 1763. Remember, the British government said you can't move on to this land you just won because the Native Americans are being upset, or they're becoming upset. And so the Native Americans tried to help the British during the American Revolution in the hopes that they would be able to keep their land. Well, after the American Revolution, we know they lost. We have a new constitution, and Americans want to move west. They want more land, and so there's going to be many more violent altercations with Native Americans. And the Native Americans keep getting pushed further and further west, no matter what they do. Multiple presidents had various policies dealing with Native Americans. So Thomas Jefferson said if Native Americans adopt the American way of life, they can stay on their land. So this is not from Thomas Jefferson's presidency, but it's a depiction of what I'm talking about. So on the left-hand side, you have traditional Native American clothing and robes and headdresses. And so on the right, you have those same boys in what the United States would call American clothes, or the American way of life. So if they switched from their way of life to the American way of life, then they could stay on their land. That's what Thomas Jefferson said. James Monroe bought land, had to buy land in 1819 because Andrew Jackson went into battle in Florida and refused to leave. And in this process, he bought land that belonged to Native Americans. But Native Americans didn't believe in owning land. So now there's this conflict. Who owns this land that we are on? And why are we talking about owning land? Because we don't believe in that. Okay, so there's this concept called assimilation. And assimilation means that you change your way of life to conform to a new way of life. So there were 5 tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw. And these are the 5 tribes. And they adopted white, quote unquote, policies so that they could stay on their land without selling to the government. They changed their way of life so they could keep their land per policies put in place by Thomas Jefferson. They changed the way they farmed, the way they educated, and the way that they participated with the United States. Well, guess what? The United States presidents changed, and this was no longer acceptable. So this is where your timeline information starts. Andrew Jackson, who remember caused problems with James Monroe's presidency down in Florida, is a problem once again. So in 1834, Andrew Jackson creates this thing called Indian Territory. It's this red chunk right here. It's essentially Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota. No Americans wanted to move here, so Andrew Jackson said, fine, this is now Indian Territory. And Native Americans were moved off of their land and forced to move to these designated lands. So they moved from the south with this gorgeous weather and fertile land where they could grow all these crops, where they knew how to live, where their families were raised, where their families were buried. And they had to move to this land in the middle of the United States. Not as much water, not as much rainfall, the soil's not as fertile, but they were forced to move. In 1830, Andrew Jackson instates this thing called the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act allowed the federal government to pay Native American tribes to move to the Indian Territory. Tribes had to accept the treaty in order to move. And once they did, Native Americans relocated to Indian Territory. Seems all fine and dandy till we get to the Cherokee. So in 1832, Cherokee Indians refused to give up their land and sued the United States in Worcester versus Virginia. Worcester versus Georgia. Georgia tried to take the land from the Cherokee Indians. So the Cherokee went straight to the Supreme Court and said, whoa, 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 not going to happen. The Cherokee won, and it said that only the federal government could remove Native Americans, not the state of Georgia. We think this is a win. However, Jackson, being his Jackson self, said John Marshall has made this decision. John Marshall was a Supreme Court judge. So John Marshall has made this decision. Now let him enforce it. So remember, we're supposed to have checks and balances where the Supreme Court makes sure that the president's not out of control. Guess who's out of control? Andrew Jackson. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do this. Jackson said, well, come down here and make me. They didn't. And so Jackson was allowed to do whatever he wanted. Nobody else ever stepped in to put him in check. So his power was not checked, and the Cherokee Indians were forcibly removed from their lands. 1835. The federal government went down to the Cherokee, and they convinced some of the Cherokee Nation to sign a treaty giving up their land. Not all of the Cherokee agreed. And so that comes into play in 1838 to 1839 when we get the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was this time period where General Scott, who is a military general, led his troops to forcibly remove Native Americans from their land. They rounded up all these Native Americans, put them into stockades. Stockades are like horse stalls. And white settlers were allowed to loot or steal things from Native American homes while they were locked up. That just doesn't seem right to me, but that's just me. These Native Americans were forced to walk 1,200 miles in winter. They had very little food, very little water. They had military pushing and prodding them like they were cattle. They walked from Georgia to Oklahoma, and over 5,000 Cherokee Indians died in this walk. It is one of the largest Native American genocides of our time. Okay, so you're going to use this information that I just went over to do your timeline. Then you're going to read the paper about the Trail of Tears. There's a settler's perspective and there's a Native American perspective. And you're going to use that information to create 2 sensory poems for your foldable.